Well, thanks for having me today, and thank you, Pete, for that presentation. That was great. You really set the stage for what some of the challenges are that coastal communities and property owners face with their bluff erosion issues. I work on a lot of projects up and down the coast of Maine and really enjoy working with coastal property owners to help them deal with the challenges that are faced in the coastal environment, which are many right now, especially with increasing threats from sea level rise and climate change. So I wanted to just share a little bit today about some practical approaches to how we can design and implement a coastal bluff protection project. Kind of as consultants, as designers, if we're coming in to help out a property owner, how do we assess the site? How do we start to identify what the issues are and what approaches might be taken to deal with those issues? So, yeah, Pete gave a really great summary of a coastal bluff system. This slide doesn't look quite as fancy, but basically here we're showing a typical coastal bluff where we might have a structure in close proximity to the bluff that the owner would like to protect. A steeper coastal bluff that's subject to erosion, and beyond the toe of the bluff, a coastal beach. And when we start to look at a site like this, we want to understand what are the risks, what are the contributing factors to erosion or instability of a bluff like this. One of the common factors is erosion of the toe due to exposure of erodible soils to wave action, to high water, to the coastal forces from storm events. And so we need to make sure that we are providing some form of protection to that toe. And we need to plan for that level of protection to be effective both in present conditions, in the current storm exposure, as well as ideally in future conditions as well. With increasing sea levels and increasing storm intensity, there's potential that the toe of that slope could be subject to greater levels of risk. So we want to implement some form of protection for the toe, and I've shown a few images there on this slide that range from harder solutions through softer solutions. And it's really something that needs to be evaluated for each site to determine what is appropriate based on the level of risk for the site. So we do try to move toward implementation of green solutions as much as possible, but in environments that are subject to greater coastal erosion, sometimes it is necessary to incorporate a stone sill or a stone toe. We've also used some options like utilizing tree logs to stabilize a toe. And then another option is to use a coir log material, so that's a biodegradable coconut fiber-based material. And really, when in an ideal situation, you would have enough distance between the toe of the bluff and the ocean to have a healthy dune or fringing marsh system that can also serve to protect that toe. Another important issue is how you deal with upland site water. Pete talked a bit about this. And so some of the issues that we see are when upland site water is not managed well, surface water runoff can run down the slope, can contribute to superficial erosion of the bluff. Water, as Pete mentioned, can also infiltrate the bluff soils and contribute to instability. So one of the things that we're often trying to do in a bluff erosion project is to improve upland site stormwater management. Some of the techniques that we might use are incorporation of French drains on the property. So you can see a couple of pictures here where a drain was put in right beyond the bluff crest to intercept that water and redirect it so that it wouldn't run directly down the slope. In some cases, it's dealt with through site grading, incorporating swales and berms to redirect the stormwater, and in some cases also plunge pools like you see on the far right here, or bioretention cells, which allow us to utilize natural materials to help deal with stormwater. Another issue is instability of the bluffs. So a bluff that's been eroding may be at a very steep slope that really is steeper than is stable for the soil conditions that exist on the site. So often on bluff projects, we're looking to cut the slope of that bluff back to a slope that can be stable for the conditions on the site. Now, one thing you can see here is that when I show the regraded slope, I'm basing that the toe of the slope on basically keeping it at the existing location of the toe of slope. So typically, in order to work within the constraints of state and federal regulations, we are trying to keep the toe where it is and not extend further into the coastal wetland. So cutting the slope back does mean cutting into the upland property, and that can be a challenge in some cases, especially when there's a structure close to the bluff crest. But that can be an important element to stabilizing a bluff. And then it's also important to think about and look at what vegetation exists on site. When there are healthy trees near the top of the bluff, set back sufficiently from the bluff, the root structure can contribute to keeping the area stable. But as Pete described, when there are trees that are on the bluff that are actively being undermined, that can actually start to be a significant problem, where it can put more of the bluff at risk of greater instability if those trees fall and carry much of the bluff soils with them. Management of vegetation on coastal bluffs is a very important aspect. Often on projects, when there is a bluff that lacks vegetation on the bluff face, we'll look to reestablish vegetation, utilizing reinforcing mats for the surface, and then replanting the surface with native species to revegetate that surface. And then also often incorporating vegetated buffers at the top of the bluff, which can help to absorb some of the stormwater from the site. I wanted to show a few project examples that just show a range of different techniques. This first one is from Massachusetts, but was a nice example of a site that incorporated a few different techniques that can be used. This was a long section of eroding bluff, and with varying exposure at different places within the project area. So portions of the project used a stone toe, as you can see here, to protect the toe. And then in less severely exposed regions, the toe was protected using a series of tree logs. And then above that toe protection, the slope was reconstructed using a series of terraces that were built using coir logs, so that natural coconut fiber material, with live stake plantings. You can see a little bit here, there's stakes sticking out between those terraces. So those eventually will establish and grow additional vegetation on the slope. And then the slope itself was planted with native shrubs and perennials, and drainage through the area was improved by including a curtain drain along the top of the slope to intercept the runoff from the upland sites. This is another example a little closer to home. This is a site on Casco Bay. This was a residential coastal embankment that was eroding. And in this case, a number of different solutions were employed. One was that the bluff that was experiencing erosion did have a slope that was that was steeper than ideal to maintain a stable slope for the conditions on site. So the slope was cut back to provide a stable embankment slope. A stone toe was incorporated, but really just including stone for the section of the bottom of the slope that's under greatest attack from coastal forces. And then above that stone toe, the slope was reinforced with a biodegradable mat and native plantings. And then in front of the slope, there was a section of fringe marsh, and portions of that were restored by incorporating coir logs and replanting sections of that marsh. This is another example. This one's in Yarmouth. Another residential shoreline project. And again, this section of shoreline was eroding, and the owner was interested in protecting it to prevent further loss of that section of bluff. In this case, again, it's a fairly exposed location, so we did incorporate a stone toe, but then above that toe, incorporated a section of planted bluff and a vegetated buffer above between the edge of the lawn and the bluff itself. And you can see in the image here where there's actually a fence line which keeps that area kind of protected and separated so that the vegetation is allowed to establish and flourish in that area and perform beneficial functions. This is another project also in Yarmouth, and this was a residential site. The shoreline here was eroding. They also had problems with invasive Japanese knotweed on this slope, and some of the erosion issues at this site were related to upland runoff and how that was running down the slope and not managed well in this area. So this project incorporated again a small section of stone toe to protect the toe, and then the slope itself was revegetated after removal of invasives. It was replanted with native species, as well as a biodegradable mat on the slope surface. And an important aspect to the design here was that drainage from the site was improved. So drainage was redirected through a drainage ditch and to a plunge pool where it was redirected through an outfall through the stone toe. This site also incorporated an embankment stair, so sometimes when bluff erosion projects are undertaken, it's also a good opportunity to think about, are there ancillary projects that you can implement, improving shoreline access, for example, at the same time the project is done. All right. So, and I just wanted to summarize and end here with some key takeaways, which that I think are important to take from this presentation and take as you think about bluff stabilization projects. One is that every site's unique. So as we go into a project, it's important to identify what the specific challenges are with that site, what the specific risks are, and have multiple tools in the toolbox to deal with those risks. In some sites will tend more toward softer solutions, and in some cases fully green solutions. Others are, just due to the level of coastal exposure, require some amount of hardening, but ideally that hardening is done in combination with green methods as well. So again, starting with defining the problems and the goals, it's important to identify what the constraints are to any coastal bluff stabilization project. So that includes physical constraints of the site, regulatory constraints, understanding what are the thresholds that you should work within so that you can design a permittable project, as well as constructability constraints, and also financial constraints, especially with private property owners. There are limits to how much can be spent on projects, so sometimes design decisions have to be made based on those constraints. Constructability is important to keep in mind in designing any bluff protection project. Often these projects are being completed on sites that have very challenging access with steep slopes and limitations on access from the water, tidal limitations, challenges with getting equipment and materials through the upland site. So it's important to think about how construction will take place and incorporate that into design decisions. And then finally, just designing for resilience. And I think one really key thing that I like to hit home when we talk about resilience is that resilience doesn't always mean designing for being able to withstand the worst possible conditions that could ever occur. Resilience means being able to withstand those worst conditions and avoid catastrophic impacts, but also to be able to bounce back quickly. So there may need to be, especially with softer solutions, some maintenance activities that happen after major storm events. But we want the designs to be resilient so that when major storms happen, we avoid the worst impacts and we're able to come back and restore the design easily so that it can perform long into the future. So I think I'm about out of time, and I think we're going to go right to the next speaker here before questions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm Tim Forrester with Flycatcher. So thank you all for having me here today. It really is a pleasure to be here and to speak before everyone. So I'd like to talk today about how we as consultants are trying to make some changes and evolving from our gray solutions into more green solutions, and trying to incorporate other methodologies as opposed to strictly hard armoring projects and coming up with other solutions. So the picture here is a pretty typical shoreline restoration project. It's recently completed, and it's we're using standard blasted quarry rock. That's large angular riprap. The purpose of that is to help deflect wave action and absorb some of the energy so that it's not bouncing either straight back and pulling out the salt marsh, having impacts on adjacent properties, or continuing to erode up onto the slope. Some of which you can't avoid. The wraparound effect of hard armament is a problem that we try to work with. In this particular project, above the riprap, you can see we installed a bunch of plantings, and we're only halfway done. We stopped because of the time of year. It was getting hot, and later in the fall we'll continue to plant more. And not just the side slope that you see here, but also up into the lawn area to establish that vegetated buffer. So this is one of the projects that we're currently working on, and it's currently under review, so hopefully we'll get some good blessings from this today. And I brought up this slide because for me the fun part is when you actually come onto the site and you start looking around to figure out what's happening here, why is there erosion, what are the conditions, what are the circumstances. And as you can see, there's a fairly large house pretty close to the shore. There's a pretty good expanse of lawn. There's a few trees left. But one of the things that I look for is actually not what's happening right here on the site, but what's it look like next door. So I'll walk into the woods and, what are the dominant plant species? What kind of trees are out there? What does the shoreline look like on the undeveloped piece adjacent to it? And then kind of use that information to come back and start working on the rest of the project. You can see that the slope itself is vegetated, but upon further look, a lot of this is oak that's been topped, so they're maintaining their view, which I get. You can see it's a lot of clay soils. It's starting to get undercut. So this is somewhat in the early stage of a site that is potentially going to have some issues. The more significant areas, you can see this undercut slope. It actually extends up probably 4 to 5 feet in the worst worst places. But there's also a fringing salt marsh in front of it that's nice and healthy. There's a little gap in between where the salt marsh is and where the upland is now, probably because that's where it's eroded. You get a lot of the rack line will settle in there and smother out that salt marsh a little bit. There's significant undercutting underneath the trees. You can see these old roots. There's also invasive species in here. There's nightshade, there's poison ivy. Neither one's very useful. But the big issue is at the top of the slope where the existing lawn runs along, and you can see this line right here where it's starting to fail. So if steps aren't taken, the potential for a rotational failure exists here where this whole slope can potentially let go. And it's the same thing on the other side. Pretty somewhat typical of a lot of sites. A nice lawn. This particular one, they cut down on the slide. I guess you can't see what I'm doing over here. They keep this area on the top of the side slope trimmed back as well. So how to fix something like that? The big thing is reestablishing that upland buffer. So we have a pretty robust planting plan along the entire side slope up onto the lawn and going back at least 10 feet. So the whole thing is about a 20-foot area from where it's cut now up onto the lawn along the entire stretch that's been managed, if you will, for the view. But then down on the toe of the slope, there's some things that need to happen as well. And in this one, it's significant enough and steep enough in here, or a tall enough scarp that we decided to just use standard riprap in that area. And also underneath the dock, which is a whole nother topic. You build the dock structures, you get a lot of shading underneath, and none of that vegetation grows. And really, riprap's one of the only way to maintain that underneath so that you don't have a failure of the dock structure. But on the other side, the erosion's far less significant. So here's a tree that fell over a couple of years ago. It's probably 3 feet in diameter. No, actually, I think it's only about 20 inches in diameter. And it's smothering out the salt marsh down and below it, but it's free structure. So we're going to grab that, spin it around, and cable it off at the toe of the slope and fill that scarp area that's just starting to erode. And then beyond that, we're tapering down core logs that'll be helical anchored down into the clay. And clay and helic anchors have tremendous holding strength. So that's going to work really well along that toe. And it's kind of a preemptive process here. We're getting a hold of this before the big failure happens. So this is just a cross-section of those two areas where a typical riprap is installed, typically on a 1.5 to 1 slope. We like to put in there's filter fabric that goes in behind it, a larger crushed stone material, not small stuff, because the small crushed stone will just get sucked out and become part of the marsh, but larger, more like 4 to 6 inch stone that just sets a good foundation for the larger rock to sit on. And then we're trying not to do anything where the vegetation is thick and lush, other than asking them not to trim it anymore. And then above that, these are the areas on the side slope and up above that we'll replant. This is the same image, but shows the use of the core logs at the toe of the slope. So these are 20-inch diameter coconut fiber rolls, and you're using helical anchors and steel cables to hold them into place. They are biodegradable, but part of the advantage to these in an early erosion issue, and in other examples as well, is that you can plant in between the rolls, and the dune grass does incredibly well in there. So you can stick the product in, put the next roll above it, and if a storm blows through, it'll snap off the top of the grass, but the root structures stay embedded into the core, so they can regrow. I've been working a lot with Seth Wilkinson, who couldn't be here today, and I told him I'd share some of his information. So Seth and I have been looking at projects kind of up and down the coast a lot in this area on how to deal with this from a more green approach. And as you've seen in some of the other standard slides that the others have shown, a typical scenario shows the fringing salt marsh and what happens when that gets knocked out, and then the failure of the side slope as that comes along. Fine print. So one of the things that we can do here is to try to reclaim that fringing salt marsh, and we're using core products again and taking core fiber and organic material and basically building a pillow or a blanket and locking that into the ground, and then pre-planting that with dune grass and setting it to an appropriate elevation so that as the slope changes and that starts to become more wet, it'll sprout up and you'll regain that fringing salt marsh, which helps protect the toe of the slope. So another implementation of core log use on significant sloped projects, and these can be done all around here, not just in sand environments, but in some of our clay environments as well. Using the core fibers, the same helical anchors, but also setting what we call a lift down in behind that, and you stack and tier this as you go up. And the idea, the concept behind it is that these are below grade, and you're putting material over the top of this and then replanting it. And the idea is that area gets to stay stable. Some of it may get eroded over time, and you may lose the toe of the slope. You may lose some of those bottom plantings, but you still have this core underlayer that is able to withstand the storm surge. So this is one of the examples that they have that Seth has done down in Massachusetts, so this is on the Cape. This is looking straight across. It has a little bit of an open fetch, Portugal. So it's a sandy slope where all the vegetation has been either removed or dead or diseased, and then how he went about fixing this one was the same methods, the same slides that I shared, where he put in the core logs and the core lift, and then replanted the whole thing. And this is at the first year, and then this is how it looks today. And so it's a pretty great system, I think. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was looking at projects early on and dealing with issues early on. This is a site in Cumberland that I looked at before the storms and worked with a client, came up with some rough estimates, some rough numbers of how we could go about addressing the situation here. And they got a little gun shy. Then the storm blew through. So what the other thing that this shows is exactly what everyone else has touched upon, but it's all about land management. And if you look on the picture on the right, there's hardly any vegetation in there. Almost all the trees are gone. On the opposite side, there's a 4-foot diameter oak that's lying in the ocean now. And it's so there's a lack of woody vegetation. There's very little ground cover trees. There's no diversity in the types of vegetation that's up there. So you have very shallow root systems. There's sheet flow that comes across the lawn. It's kind of the perfect storm here. And that's what resulted in this gigantic rotational failure that instead of what could have been fixed early on for less time, less effort, and less structure, now they have a pretty significant problem on their hands.